Can you pull up the John Hopkins article? I just want to read this and get Jordan's
that article.
Yeah. So here's CNN, MSNBC, New York Times, WAPO, Washington Post completely avoid John Hopkins study finding COVID lockdowns ineffective. FYI, would you say John Hopkins is a conservative organization like Hoover Institute?
No.
Or Heritage? They're not,
Johns
right?
Hopkins is one of the most reliable medical, scientific research enterprises, universities in the world, bar none.
That's very important for people
to know,
because
Hopkins
sometimes
is
you're
extremely reliable.
Yeah. So it's not like it's a CNN or a
this
Fox
is
where
like
you know where
this is Harvard, Oxford, Cambridge level. Johns Hopkins, especially in the medical domain.
So watch this. ABC, CBS, NBC also ignored the anti-lockdown study. So go up, let me read this. So here we go. There has been a full-on media blackout on the study online, the ineffectiveness of lockdowns to prevent COVID deaths. According to Johns Hopkins University meta-analysis of several studies, lockdowns during first COVID wave in spring of 2020 only reduced COVID mortality by 0.2%. That is not a lot. In US and in Europe, while the meta-analysis concludes that lockdowns have had little to no public health effect, they have imposed enormous economic and social costs where they have been adopted, the researcher wrote. In consequence, lockdowns policies are ill-founded and should be rejected as a pandemic policy instrument. If you can go a little higher, I want to read the next two, and I'll get Jordan's thoughts. However, the Johns Hopkins study received no mention on any of the 5 liberal networks this week, according to Grabian transcripts. CNN, MSNBC, ABC, CBS, NBC all ignored the anti-lockdowns findings after having spent much of the pandemic shaming red states with minimal restrictions and events deemed by critics as super spreaders. It wasn't just the networks avoiding the study. The New York Times, the Washington Post, the Associated Press, Reuters, USA Today, Axios, Politico, amongst other outlets also tuned a blind eye to the findings according to search results. Mm-hmm. Jordan, how important is this research? Like, how important is this analysis that we're reading here right now? What does this tell us?
Well, I should tell you what a meta-analysis is to begin with. Well, imagine there's a group of studies done on a particular topic, and you write a review, and you try to interpret the findings. That was called a narrative review. You use your opinion, in some sense, to wade through the data and try to understand what the compilation of studies reveals. Well, there were techniques developed 25 years ago that are statistical, where you can aggregate the statistical results from studies statistically. So you do a statistical analysis of all the statistical analysis, and that's a meta-analysis, and hypothetically it's more objective. And there's some truth to that claim. You still have to select which studies to include, but I don't believe that that was a detriment in this particular case. And so solid methodology. And it's basically something approximating a cost-benefit analysis, and that's tough too, because it's not that easy to assign costs and benefits in a quantitative manner. Having said all that, it's an amazing study, not only because of what it reveals, which is a 0.2% decline in overall mortality, but also in that the researchers felt so strongly about their findings that they came right out and said that this was ineffective policy. And that isn't that common for researchers who generally hold off on drawing that sorts of conclusions. They kind of lay out the facts.
Not a black and white. They're typically not going to come out as black and white, is what you're saying?
Yes, okay. Exactly. And so that's really something. We rushed to imitate a totalitarian state in panic, and the consequence of that, according to this study, was there's nothing positive about it. Now, I've talked with some Democrats about this study because they were paying attention to it, and their response is something like, well, it did help control hospital overrun. And time will tell whether or not that's true. I think the data suggesting that COVID vaccines decreased the seriousness of illness when people contracted COVID who were vaccinated, I think that data is credible. I could be wrong about that because things are being done in a rush, and it's very difficult to draw appropriate scientific conclusions in a rush. But I think the bulk of the information suggests that. But I also think that is not how they were marketed, and that was not the initial intent, to merely reduce severity of the illness. It was to reduce transmission and so forth. And then, of course, this is a cost-benefit analysis, which says, yeah, there was some gain on that front, conceivably, maybe, although all-cause mortality doesn't seem to have gone down much at all. But the economic the secondary consequences were devastating. And, well, we don't even know what the secondary consequences are yet. You know, here's one secondary consequence, which is revealed in what you just read. The collusion of the press and the government. Like, how do you know that's not worse than the epidemic? It could easily be worse than the epidemic, or the idea that now we've been coerced into having to share our medical information with people all through the bureaucratic hierarchy, all the way down to servers in restaurants. So we've trained people that that's okay to ask and also to offer. Is that worse than the pandemic? Well, these are arguably, all of this involves violation of our fundamental rights. Where's the evidence that that's not worse? Well, we're going to see it play out. Well, the collusion between the press and the government, that's so intense in Canada, as I already said. When the ex-premier of Newfoundland wanted to launch his constitutional challenge, he couldn't use a mainstream news source. I mean, that's a bloody catastrophe. Much as I dislike CBC, which is a lot, by the way, I think that it's an absolute catastrophe that it's come to that. And that's just one of, two consequences of the lockdown. There's the supply chain problem. That's a big one. My publisher, Penguin, told me a week and a half ago, we were talking about putting out a 2-volume set of my last 2 books, which I would really like to do. They're going to do that in Great Britain. I think that people would turn to it as a gift for graduations and so on. That would be a nice set for that. They told me they can't get paper. This is Penguin Random House, right? And it's paper. Paper isn't that complex, given how complex everything is. The fact that there are paper shortages, that's a big deal. I was in a Mazda dealership in Canada a couple of months ago now. They had 1 car. 1 isn't very many cars, and so we have no idea what the supply line crunch is going to produce in terms of economic catastrophe.
Seriously, though.
And then the next issue is, well, how about all the money we've been printing? We've already seen that produce a massive bubble expansion in housing prices. That's being driven by other factors.
Yep.
How do we know that's not worse than the pandemic? It could easily be. I'm not saying that it is, because I don't know, but that's the issue. I don't know. And this is partly why this mad rush to impose top-down solutions to complex problems, this is in some sense what makes me a conservative insofar as I am. It's part of the caution I learned as a social scientist.
So if you enjoyed this little short segment from the podcast that we did, here's another short segment to watch. Or if you want to see the entire podcast, click over here. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.